It is 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the 15th of April, 1945, on a quiet side road in northern Germany. A single wooden pole is lowered across the road to mark a boundary. A British loudspeaker truck pulls up to it, and a young officer steps down. His name is Lieutenant Derek Sington, a journalist in civilian life, now with the Intelligence Corps. Waiting for him at that pole is a German officer in a clean, freshly pressed uniform. The German is calm, almost businesslike. He introduces himself as the commandant. He speaks to the British officer as one professional to another, ready to hand over his command in an orderly fashion. And he even offers a little friendly advice on how to manage what he calls the unpleasant situation inside. He has come to surrender, and he plainly expects to do it with the honor owed to a soldier. What the British did with that expectation over the days that followed is the story. The man in the pressed uniform was named Josef Kramer. He was the commandant of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And to understand why his calm, correct, officer-to-officer manner would not save him, you first have to understand what he thought was about to happen. There is an old tradition in European warfare called the honors of war. When a garrison that has fought bravely finally surrenders, the victor allows it to march out with dignity flags flying, drums beating, heads up, and then its soldiers are treated as honorable prisoners of war. It is a gesture of respect between fighting men. It says, "You lost, but you fought as soldiers, and we will treat you as soldiers." For centuries, that was the code. A beaten officer expected to hand over his sword and his post and walk into captivity with his honor intact. Josef Kramer expected exactly that. He met the British in his best uniform. He behaved as if the camp behind him were simply a difficult posting, a logistical problem he had been managing, and now he was conducting a proper handover to the next set of officers. He dealt with the British as equals. He believed the uniform he wore still meant something. He believed the rules between soldiers would protect him. He was about to learn that the men arriving at that gate did not see a soldier at all. Let's go back 3 days, to the 12th of April, 1945. The war in Europe is in its final weeks. The British Second Army is driving northeast across Germany. And something strange happens. Word reaches the British 8th Corps headquarters that the Germans want to arrange a local truce, not a battle, but a quiet handover of a specific place. The reason is disease. Inside the Bergen-Belsen camp, typhus is raging out of control, and the German command is terrified the epidemic will spread to the troops on both sides. So, an agreement is reached. A neutral zone is drawn around the camp. Signs reading, "Danger Typhus," are posted along the road in English. The fighting units will pass it by, and a British detachment will come in and take control. This was the arrangement Kramer was operating under. From his point of view, it was almost a courtesy. The Germans had volunteered to hand the place over peacefully. In his mind, that made it a gentleman's agreement between armies, and he was the officer entrusted to carry it out. So on that Sunday afternoon, the British came down the wooded road. The first vehicles belonged to the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment and to Sington's loudspeaker unit, the advance guard of the 11th Armored Division. They were experienced men. They had fought their way across Europe since the Normandy landings. They had seen towns flattened, comrades killed. Every ugly thing a long war can show a soldier. And then they drove through the gate, and they found something none of their training had prepared them for. Inside the wire were around 60,000 prisoners, still alive, but barely, starving, skeletal, dying of typhus and dysentery and hunger, packed into filthy huts. And scattered across the ground, in the open, between the buildings, lay the dead. 13,000 corpses, unburied, left where they had fallen. A British war correspondent named Richard Dimbleby walked in shortly after and recorded a report for the BBC. He described an acre of ground where the dead and the dying lay together so closely that you could not always tell which was which. When his report aired, it was the first time the British public truly understood what the camps were. Soldiers who had stormed beaches and crossed rivers under fire stood at that gate and could not speak. It is worth pausing on who those people were, because Kramer spoke of them as a logistical problem. They came from more than 20 nations. Among the dead at Belsen, somewhere in those last terrible weeks, were a teenage girl named Anne Frank and her older sister Margot, who had been moved there from Auschwitz and died of typhus within sight of liberation. Only weeks before the British arrived, they were two names among tens of thousands, and almost none of the others have a marker at all. That is the scale of what the man in the pressed uniform was calling an unpleasant situation. Now hold those two images together. The commandant at the pole in his pressed uniform, expecting the honors of war, and the 13,000 bodies lying in the spring mud a few hundred yards behind him. This is the moment the whole story turns on, because the British looked at Josef Kramer, and they looked at what was behind him, and they refused him every single thing he expected. There was no honorable handover. There was no soldier's surrender. Sington did not salute him or shake his hand or accept his sword like a fellow officer. Instead, he ordered Kramer up onto the running board of the loudspeaker van and made him ride there, clinging to the side of a British vehicle to guide them through the camp he had run. The commandant, who had wanted to be treated as an equal, was now a man standing on the step of someone else's truck, pointing out the geography of his own crime. That same day, Kramer was placed under arrest. Not taken as a prisoner of war, with the courtesies of rank arrested, as a criminal. At one point he was made to pick up a wounded prisoner and carry the man to the hospital block himself. And then the British did the thing that answered Kramer's expectation completely and forever. They handed the SS guards shovels. The men and women of the SS who had run Bergen-Belsen were put to work burying the dead. They were marched out among the thousands of bodies and made to gather them up, often with their bare hands, to load them onto carts and into the great pits being dug in the earth, and to bury their own victims while the surviving prisoners stood and watched. There are films of it. You can see the guards stumbling under the weight of the corpses, and the liberated prisoners standing along the edges, watching the people who had tormented them finally forced to touch the consequences of what they had done. It was the exact opposite of the honors of war. There was no dignity in it, and the British intended that there be none. The conditions were so lethal that a number of those guards caught typhus during the burial work and died in the weeks afterward. This was a deliberate decision, and it carried a clear message. The honors of war are given to soldiers. The British had decided that the people who built and ran this place were not soldiers in any sense the tradition recognized. They had forfeited it. A uniform does not make a man a soldier when the work of that uniform is mass starvation. So the British refused the salute, refused the handover, refused the whole comfortable fiction that this was a military matter between honorable enemies. They treated the SS not as a defeated garrison, but as what the evidence showed them to be. The British did not only punish. While some soldiers guarded the captured SS, others threw everything they had into trying to save the living. A senior army doctor, Brigadier Glyn Hughes, organized a desperate relief effort. Food, clean water, makeshift hospitals, set up in nearby army barracks. But the prisoners were so far gone that thousands could not be saved no matter what was done. In the weeks after liberation, nearly 14,000 more people died, their bodies too broken to recover even with care and food finally in front of them. In late May, to stop the typhus once and for all, the British burned the huts of Bergen-Belsen to the ground. The whole place was put to the torch, and the smoke could be seen for miles. And here is the part where everyone, the guards, the British, and soon the whole world, understood what had just happened. For the SS, the realization came as the shovels were pressed into their hands. The uniform they had hidden behind meant nothing here. There would be no marching out with heads high. There would be a reckoning. The British were so determined that the truth be known, that they brought the mayors and citizens of the nearby towns into the camp and forced them to walk past the open graves and look at what had been happening a few kilometers from their homes. No one was going to be allowed to say they had not seen it. Then came the law. The British did not take their revenge with a bullet in the chaos of liberation, though no one could have blamed exhausted, sickened men for wanting to. They did something harder and more lasting. They built a case. From September to November of 1945, in the German town of Lüneburg, the British held a military trial. 45 men and women who had worked at Belsen and other camps sat in the dock and answered for it, in open court, in front of more than 100 journalists from around the world. Josef Kramer, by then known in the newspapers as the Beast of Belsen, was there. So was Irma Grese, a guard barely 22 years old whose cruelty had become infamous. So was the head female guard, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and the camp doctor, Fritz Klein. 11 of them, including Kramer, were sentenced to death. In December of 1945, they were hanged. The commandant, who had stepped forward in his pressed uniform, expecting the honors of a soldier's surrender, went to the gallows as a convicted criminal, his name a byword for cruelty. The proceedings recorded for history so that no one could ever pretend it had not happened. That is what British troops did when the SS tried to surrender with honors. They took away the honors. They stripped the uniform of its protection. They put the guards among the bodies and made them dig. And then they wrote the whole thing into the record of the world, in a courtroom, under oath, so that the men who had wanted to walk away as soldiers would instead be remembered exactly as they were. The honors of war exist to recognize courage and decency between enemies. The British refusal at Belsen was, in the end, a kind of verdict, a statement that some things a person does in a uniform place him entirely outside the brotherhood that the honors are meant to protect. By handing the SS those shovels, the British forced them to measure, with their own hands and their own backs, the exact weight of what they had done. 13,000 bodies, one at a time. So here's the question I want to leave with you, and I really do want to hear what you think. Were the British right to deny the SS the honors of war and treat them as criminals rather than as soldiers? Or does the code between fighting men matter so much that it should be extended even to the very worst of enemies? It is not as simple a question as it first sounds, and there are serious people who have argued both sides. Tell me where you land in the comments. If this story mattered to you, take 1 second and press the like button. It genuinely is the thing that tells YouTube to carry this history to more people. And the people who suffered at Belsen deserve to be remembered. And there is more to tell. The trial at Lüneburg pulled back the curtain on individual guards whose stories are almost impossible to believe, including Irma Grese, the young woman the prisoners called the most feared person in the camp, and the strange, chilling question of how someone so ordinary became so cruel. That is the story I'll tell in the next video. So subscribe, and you won't miss it. Thanks for watching.